Hello, welcome back to the Midnight Quill podcast. In our 5th episode, we're talking about setting the scene. I'm one of your hosts, Tegan, also known as TC Emerys. I'm a writer, professional ghostwriter, and fiction editor. My debut short story collection, The Weight of Rain, was released last year. Now over to my co-hosts.
My name is Maisy Osbon. I'm primarily a screenwriter, but I also dabble in poetry.
Hi, my name is Maddy, or MJ Glenn. I've written a fantasy novel called On the Edge. I'm also the CEO of Software Self-Publishing, a business that helps authors through the entire writing and self-publishing process.
Today we're going to be talking about using settings in your narrative. Let's firstly talk about what a setting actually is. A setting is not just a location, it's the backdrop to the narrative. This encompasses the physical location, but also the time, the mood, the culture, and the atmosphere. I found a beautiful quote about settings from Carmen Maria Machado, I hope I'm pronouncing that surname correctly, that I'd like to share to kick off our discussion. Places are never just places in a piece of writing. If they are, the author has failed. Setting is not inert, it is activated by point of view. So thinking about that quote, what do you both think makes a narrative setting engaging for the reader?
The character doesn't just exist in the setting, the character has to interact with the setting.
Yeah.
The character exists almost because of the setting.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a character in itself, almost.
Yeah.
Or it should be, I think is what she's implying.
In the works that you study at school and stuff, you would be able to analyze the setting as a character in itself in the sort of more complex analytical works. Definitely the setting is its own personality and causes its own sort of story.
For me, the greatest joy of reading, really, besides maybe character, is setting. I mean, if you think of any fantasy world you've ever read, like, it stays with you vividly. It's I think it's really powerful to create a setting that can continue after the book has ended in the reader's heads.
Yeah, for example, like people don't really want to be Harry Potter, but they do want to be in Hogwarts.
Yeah, that was one of the examples I have actually, is Hogwarts. I think it's just like it exists outside of those books and the films completely now.
Yeah, I think as well, like if you were to take the story and change the setting, it wouldn't work anymore. That's why it's so important. Yeah,
and that's the issue they've had with the Fantastic Beasts films, in my opinion, right? Like
I've not seen them.
Have you not?
Oh, don't.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they're terrible. I think basically J.K. Rowling was like, I need to give my American fans some
content.
Some content, yeah. So
it's just that they picked up a very English fantasy world, and put it in a very not English fantasy world, and they definitely jar.
Completely. It's really, really weird, and it feels more like an action film, the first one at least. Like it doesn't feel like Harry Potter at all, and it's not.
Like
it's just
it's like if you tried to put Hobbiton into America.
Yeah,
you just wouldn't find Hobbiton in America.
No, exactly. And they even changed like the language around magic. They changed some of the cultural things to do with magic, and like it just didn't work. So instead of saying muggles, they say, is it no magies or something?
No mage.
Yeah, and it's like, why?
I think they also changed like some of the magic rules.
I'll leave it out. How can you change the rules of magic just because you've crossed the Atlantic? Like,
it irritates most of the Harry Potter nerds.
Yeah, it was quite an upsetting experience to watch that first film, to be honest. It was, I think everyone was waiting for like a little bit of Harry Potter magic to come back to them, because, you know, like that, you want to revisit that world, and you just didn't revisit that world. So
the thing is, as we were saying, going back to the point, as we're saying, Harry Potter fits into a setting, a very specific setting, and it's a sort of modern versus Dickensian kind of English world that's sort of mashed together, and that's what Diagon Alley is, definitely quite Dickensian kind of street, and it's very set, like it looks like Edinburgh or it looks like Oxford, and it's very English setting, and the way people dress and the way people act. It's just, and it sort of was set around one society, and without that setting, it's not the Harry Potter universe anymore.
Yeah.
I
think the Harry Potter series manages to have a consistent setting even in different locations, which is kind of something I wanted to bring up, because I think a lot of writers confuse location with setting, which they're not the same thing. So you can have that same atmospheric feeling and of knowing you're in a Harry Potter novel or a Harry Potter film, no matter the physical location. It's an atmospheric thing. So like Diagon Alley, Hogwarts, they all have that like Harry Potter feeling to them.
For example, I can't remember which book it is, but one of the books starts with Snape, like as if he's a main character in Malfoy Manor, a place we've never been, with a character we've never been
Prince,
with.
I think, is it, or is it?
And yet it still feels like Harry Potter, and still got the same universe and the same feeling around it. And so it's the strength of her setting that you don't even need the main character to have the setting work.
Yeah. So some other books that I wrote down to talk about, because I thought they were good examples of well-developed settings, you guys may disagree. The Great Gatsby, I know Maddy is not keen on The Great Gatsby, but setting wise we can talk about that one. The other one I wrote down is Miss Havisham's house, from, I can't remember the name of the house. Is it
Satis house?
Satis house, right? There we go. Yeah, so I wrote down that as well. I know you like your Dickens, Maddy, so that one's for you.
I love this book.
So yeah, I just thought maybe we should talk about those and any examples that you guys can think of really good settings. Should we start with The Great Gatsby, as much as Maddy hates The Great Gatsby? Because I think, have we all read The Great Gatsby?
I did for A-level.
Yeah, I did for A-level as well.
It's one of those books where, like, for the time it was written in, it's interesting. But for a reader from the 21st century, it is boring as fuck. And you can't get away from that. You can't get away from that. It is what it is. And
I think it was okay. I think it was okay. Like, I suppose I enjoyed reading it. It was okay. I don't understand the hype, though. I don't understand how everyone analyzes it in such detail. I'm like, how? It was just okay.
Yeah, it's like, green light. He loves her. Green light at the end of the fucking thing. Come on now. You know.
They clearly shouldn't have picked this, but I quite like The Great Gatsby. I mean, it's not like in my top, it's not in my top books, but
not in my top 50.
The reason I chose it was because I think that it plays with setting to create the plot. So you've got like a class divide as well as a setting divide. So that was the reason I wanted to talk about it for setting. So for anyone who hasn't read it, you have West Egg and East Egg. One is like the old money rich people, and then the other one is the new money rich people. So you would think that it's the same, they're all rich, but actually it's a complete cultural divide, and the main character kind of experiences both because of his associations with different people.
The narrator is what makes it boring. If we were reading this story from the point of view of Gatsby, or even bloody what's Daisy, it'd be more interesting. You know?
I agree.
It's that weird passive narrator that just makes you think, why am I reading this? What am I going to get from this?
I think the thing I don't like about Gatsby is that it's a fascinating setting with not a fascinating character. So the setting just gets a bit lost for me, because the character doesn't bring it to life. Whereas Daisy, Daisy's a character could bring it to life a lot more, because I feel like she uses the setting a lot more.
Yes. There's a brilliant scene that I like, one of my favorite scenes in The Great Gatsby. It's the description of not just the heat, but the two women are laid out on the couch, and the net curtains are like moving in the hot summer breeze, and it was just like so vivid to me the first time I read it. I thought it was a really cool atmosphere that was created with this, like, these rich people, but they can't control the weather, you know, like no matter how rich they are, they still have to rely on like the wind coming in. And in our first episode, Show Don't Tell, we touched on how lengthy exposition can be tedious. How can we create a rich setting without letting the description drag on?
I think a character could interact more with the setting instead of just describing what it looks like around them. Have them use that setting. I mean, when you're in a house, you don't just stand there in the house. You interact with the surroundings to give us an idea of are we in an affluent place? Are we in a poor place? Are we in a city? Or in the woods? You know, I think, yeah, exactly. Instead of just like saying the woods were green and brown and the leaves crunched, you know, have her crunch the leaves and have her or him like interact with their surroundings. I think a lot of people, especially fantasy authors, will develop a very in-depth setting and forget to include it in their surroundings. The character has surroundings, and if you have your character interact with their surroundings, it will give the reader a huge sense of the actual setting itself.
I think it's this thing we said, maybe we said it in the first episode actually, about using all of the senses. I think sometimes when people create a setting, they just describe what you can see and not what you can hear and smell and touch and interact with.
I think as well, like the choice of words, I think it's a good idea to experiment with words that can create a bit more texture. Like instead of saying that something is red, call it rouge. Or instead of saying something soft, say it's like candy floss, you know, like experiment with different words until you find the one that fits, that makes it more interesting to you.
Absolutely. What are some examples of setting the scene through action and dialogue rather than description?
Say, take two characters who are talking politics, and have two characters. I mean, they have to be within a scene and there has to be a reason for them talking politics. But if they talk politics, you can discuss the politics of your world, whether it's a fantasy world, whether it's our world, what, you know, what era we're in. We can work out where it's set. But also the politics of people in London might be quite different to the politics of people in Scotland, for example. To be able to give it a sense of setting just by describing what's going on around them. Politics could be family politics or government politics or economics or, you know, any kind of social issues. Have your character discuss it, and the reader will be able to fit everything into place, will be able to work it out themselves where it is.
Totally. I think that's really good. I think language, and not just you know, obviously mixing in other languages if that's relevant, but language choice for dialogue is really important for setting a scene. So if you're writing historical fiction, no matter, you know, how recent or how far away it is, you need to be thinking about your language choices and, you know, slang, but also what words would be used, what register, formality, tone, etc.
But also, I mean, the background characters, not just your main characters, the background characters can have, say, jobs that fit in with the setting you're in. Like if you're in a sort of lower class setting, then think about sort of working jobs, you know, like or you might have a family of lawyers, which would give you an idea that they would be based in a city and they'd have a lot of money. And just saying about the background characters, just saying about the extra characters will give an idea of the setting.
The other thing I wanted to mention was food. I think food is so often left out of it's a frustration with watching films and TV actually, that people are just never eating ever. But food says a lot about class, food says a lot about location, food says a lot about culture, family ties, you know, recipes, cooking. Those are all so important to creating your setting, and it's just so often left out. I find that such a shame. So one of my stories is set at Christmas. It's called Parsnips. And I really wanted to sort of create that atmosphere of British Christmas through foods, quality street, burnt parsnips, you know, that kind of thing. Because it's really important to a British Christmas. And if I had written a Christmas story without any of those foods in it, I would have felt like I'd failed.
That's such an interesting point. It made me think of Only Fools and Horses. Like, you never see them, you only ever see the characters eating food that you would expect in a council flat in South London.
Right.
You're not going to see Del Boy like necking back a lobster. It's not gonna happen, you know. And you're so right. It's so crucial to the setting and to what you expect as a viewer or a reader, you know?
Yeah.
I was like, that's a really good point. I've never even thought of that before.
Yeah, same.
Thank you. You know, it actually was brought to my attention. One of the best examples that I have seen is Gilmore Girls, right?
Oh, I hate that show.
Sorry. No.
Sorry, I just have to say.
Really? Oh, you've got some fans there, I'm afraid.
Oh dear.
Carry on, though. Sorry.
Dangerous territory.
Yeah, so Gilmore Girls, not only a lot of the scenes set around meal times, and I think that is because it is so much to do with family. So like you've got the meals that happen between Rory and Lorelai are like these casual diner junk food meals, and then you have the really like the contrast with the really formal meals that they have with Lorelai's parents. But I watched an interview with Alexis Bledel, who plays Rory, and she said that she's really passionate about people actually eating in scenes. So she said that when she was younger, she used to watch actors just sit and like move bits of salad across their plate, and she said it was just not realistic at all. So her and Lauren Graham, who plays Lorelai, like if you watch them, they're always actually eating the food, and I just think it adds like such a level of realism that I'd never noticed why I felt like that until I watched that interview where she says, yeah, we always actually eat the food, because the characters aren't just sitting there going, oh, I'll just look at my pizza, you know, like they're shoving it in their faces. So yeah, so
actually, now that I think about it, Gilmore Girls really uses food as a way of developing character relationships. I mean, because her relationship, Lorelai's relationship with her mum, it's very centered around their Friday night meals and what is served at those meals and how the meals go. And there's even episodes where Rory has to try and persuade them into a more casual meal lifestyle. And it's very much shows a contrast. Wow, that's actually showing setting again, because it's very much showing a contrast between the Stars Hollow setting, which is where Lorelai and Rory live, and the parents' house setting.
Yeah, the upper class world.
Which is more posh upper class lobsters, while in Stars Hollow they'd eat pizza.
Yeah, there's a great episode where Rory gets snowed in is it Hartford they live in? Hartford, Connecticut, something like that. Rory gets snowed in with the grandparents, and their chef isn't there, and they don't cook because they're upper class, and Rory finds a frozen pizza, and it's like the first time they've ever had frozen pizza, and it's like such a great commentary on like class, and actually the granddad is like, this is great, we should have this more often. I just, because food is like the ultimate bringer together, isn't it? So as a closing question, do you think there's ever a time when setting is unimportant, and can a piece be timeless?
Now think about something like Waiting for Godot, where literally it's two characters sitting on an empty stage, pretty much. It's Samuel Beckett, so it's going to be weird, but it's two characters who sit and wait for a character that, spoilers, never turns up. Waiting for Godot. And I don't think there is any set. It's literally two characters.
How interesting.
Very long. And so I don't know if it's timeless as such, because I think people get bored of it quite easily. But it's interesting how he has come up with some kind of relationship between two characters without any setting at all.
And theatre is really interesting for setting, because you expect the audience to suspend disbelief, because obviously they can see the lights and the stage. I watched an interesting review of Cats, the movie. They did a film version of Cats. And they were saying that the problem wasn't that they were trying to make the CGI too cat-like. It was that the original stage show, you can imagine the cat-likeness because of the movement rather than the costume. So like the costume is purposefully sort of just a bit like a cat, but they're mostly ballet dancers and they move in like a feline way, whereas in the film it's just like Judi Dench and Ian McKellen walking around with CGI on their faces, and it looks fucking weird, right? So when you get setting in a theatre, you are asking the audience to create it in their minds as much as you are on a book, rather whereas film.
Yeah, no, I've been to many different theatre productions, some not my choice, some I had to go to study them. And one of the most interesting ones was called, I think it was called The Drowned Man, and it was a Punch Drunk production. And they're a company notorious for pushing the boundaries. And basically, it was in a warehouse. You put your bag in, like, you know, your regular cloakroom, and you wear a mask. Every audience member wears like one of those like bubonic plague doctor's masks,
doctor mask,
sort of thing.
yeah.
Very like garish. And you follow the story as you want. So you walk around the warehouse, and it's all very immersive. You watch the bits that you want to watch. You follow characters as they run from one room up a flight of stairs, and it's sort of 2 hours of this very strange, untraditional theatre production. And then at the end, they manage to get you all into one room, and that's sort of the finale. Now, I've got no idea what this play was about, because it was such an interesting way of immersing you, and every audience member then gets a different performance because you're in different settings. So there were some rooms that I never saw, but other rooms that like my peers did see, and for them the story was completely different. So that's an interesting way of changing setting to the point where you're not even sure what the story is anymore.
How
so
interesting.
As an experiment, yeah, it was really cool. I think as an experiment, it's cool to play with setting, but I think personally, generally, setting is so important. It's so important.
Yeah.
A book that I've mentioned before to you guys is A Little Life by Hanya Yanagihara, and I've mentioned it for different reasons. But one thing that Yanagihara does is she never gives a time or like the period of the piece.
Oh, interesting.
So yeah, so you know it's in New York. It's primarily set in New York, but they go to London a couple of times. You know the location changes, but there are no like semiotics. You don't know any movies that came out. None of the characters ever buy a book, so there's nothing to ground you in the actual time, and it's so weird as a reader. But really cool as well.
Yeah, I think a few people have tried to do that. It makes me think of Red Dwarf. Have you ever seen the TV show Red Dwarf?
No.
It's one of my favorite TV shows. So Red Dwarf started in the 80s, but it's set, so the vague plot of it is that they're on a spaceship mining Jupiter, I think, and the main character goes into temporal stasis, and he's only supposed to be in there 6 months, but when he comes out it's been 2 million years. I think it's 2 million years. Yeah. And all the crew are dead, everyone he's ever known is dead, and the spaceship has been floating through space for all that time, so they're nowhere near Earth anymore, and it's just him, a creature that evolved from the ship's cat, and a dead hologram of his old bunkmate. Anyway, it's a strange thing because the show starts set in like the 22nd century, I think, or maybe even so. It's like set in the future, but obviously it was written in the 80s and 90s, so the cultural references are like to the 80s. It's bizarre. They sort of talk about like Friday the 13th and Michael Jackson and Marilyn Monroe and stuff like that, and it's like, it's really odd because like as an audience member you know that it's meant to be set in like the future, but it's being written to make an 80s and 90s audience laugh, you know. So it's interesting setting. What would they have done in terms of comedy without that? I do really wonder, because I started watching it when I was about 14, which is what, like 11 years ago, and obviously it started coming out in the 80s, and a lot of the references go over my head, so obviously for someone in the 22nd century these things are completely irrelevant. So
yeah.
But it is what makes the show funny in some ways. There's other comedy, but yeah, so the setting is very important to that. We've kind of talked more about films today than we have about
films and plays and books. I think because books, plays, you don't have to have a setting in a play, and as you say, the viewer has to suspend disbelief. So there's a sort of a play on it. I didn't mean pun, but like you're sort of twisting that in a way. You're playing with that idea of setting, because it's not, I can say it's not a real setting. Of course, a fiction novel isn't a real setting necessarily, but in a play, it's not real.
Yeah, I was going to say, do you think maybe we can't think of as many good settings in books because maybe there is a sort of deficit of because we talked about the Harry Potter books, and that's definitely the first one that comes to mind. We mentioned like Hobbiton, Lord of the Rings, that kind of thing, definitely strong settings. Great Gatsby was one that I put as an example because the West Egg East Egg thing, but I am thinking about some of my favorite books, and some of them the settings are just not as strong, and I think maybe that's what we were talking about in our first episode of like putting trust in the reader to create a little bit of their own world, sometimes to create what the character looks like in their head. Maybe in fiction books we do put a little bit of trust in the people to come up with what it's meant to look like and feel like. I don't know, what do you think?
I think if it's set in our world, then we do expect the reader to work it out for themselves. If it's set in the world, there is a tendency to over explain or to info dump in order to give a very complex world. I mean, a story within a complex world, that doesn't mean the story has to be complex, and that doesn't mean that the reader has to know every single bit of politics in that world. If it's not going to change the character or it's not going to change the plot, then we don't need to know it. We don't need to know how the city developed or how, the politics of some war until it becomes relevant.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think that links back to what we were saying about exposition, and like I think there's a tendency with maybe fantasy and sci-fi and things set not in the real world to be like, well, I've created all this history in my head of this town or city or group of people. I'm gonna bloody tell you about it. So maybe that's why the fantasy settings that we mentioned earlier, like the Harry Potter books, Lord of the Rings, come to mind more than contemporary set stories, because they've almost had the opposite treatment, like too much setting.
But if you think about it, like the title romance genre, a romance is about characters, right? The title fantasy genre, it's fantasy because of the setting, because we're not, the characters are going to be exactly the same as everyone else in any other genre. Really, there might be elves or dragons, but the personalities, they are going to have human traits, and they're going to be the same, and there will still be romances, and it will still be called fantasy, but the idea of it being fantasy is a different setting. So I think setting is far more prevalent in the fantasy genre simply because it's fantasy. But
that's a really good point.
You've got to be really careful that you don't tell your reader every single detail you come up with about your fantasy world, because it's not necessary. But also, if you think about Harry Potter, in the first book, we don't know everything about the Harry Potter fantasy world. Neither does Harry. And by the end of the book, we know a lot more. We still don't know everything, but we do know a lot more. So in the first chapter of your first book, you don't need to tell your reader every single little detail about your amazing fantasy world, because you might have 6 more books coming that can develop it and work on it at the right time.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So I think we've said everything we want to say about setting the scene. Thank you very much for listening. Make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, leave a comment. What's your favourite setting in a fictional novel? You can also find us on Patreon and support us for as little as £1 a month. And we will see you next time.